2015, he said that attacking Syria without congressional approval was wrong. But that is essentially exactly what happened. What reasons could Donald Trump have for not waiting, not going to the UN, for instance?
Well, I think that on a personal level, he's under, as we know, huge attack from the US deep state from all directions. His key personnel are being removed. He himself is being almost the victim of a colour revolution at home as a result of the activities of his own intelligence community. So he is under great pressure to actually comply, to in effect become a neocon abroad in return for some peace at home. And it may be that right now he feels this is the only way to take some steam, ironically, out of the situation that's reached boiling point for him personally. Now, whether this situation, that is to say the attack on the attack that occurred is going to actually help take the steam out of the situation or not, that is going to be a different question. But certainly in the international context, it may well escalate things. On the other hand, it may almost serve to be a message to his own neocons: I've done what you wanted, what more can I do? That's it. And hopefully he's shown himself to be strong on one occasion for the domestic constituency, and that might well help him going forward to avoid having to do the same again.
Or perhaps shown himself to be indecisive. I'll put this point to you because it's taken just a matter of days for President Trump's Syria policy to go from Bashar al-Assad can stay, we'll get a presidential election, he can stay in the meantime, we'll work it out that way, to he must go. Let's take a listen to just some of what was said on that.
My attitude toward Syria and Assad has changed very much.
With respect to Assad,
I think the status and the longer term status of President Assad will be decided by the Syrian people.
So just going from that, Marco, it was a sudden news.
Which had this chemical after effect, was something that wasn't necessarily staged in advance, but was exploited by the neocons to say, we have the pictures, we have the footage, this is an absolutely great time to demonize the Russians for supporting the Syrians and the Syrians for allegedly firing off chemicals. So this was simply a moment too good for the neocons to lose, to waste, and they exerted the maximum amount of pressure on him to comply with their wish for an operation to occur. So really, it was a combination of pre-planning, as we've heard before, because these things can't happen and be organized at once, but exploiting an incident which would have happened sooner or later. And certainly the presence of chemical weapons and factories among the rebel forces is a matter of fact. And therefore, it's simply something like this was bound to happen sooner or later. And simply, he's been weak, but he's been weakened by a systematic process of weakening engaged on by the neocons in his own US country.
The Syrian ambassador in Moscow says that the US strikes confirm that Washington, and these are his words, supports and coordinates with Islamic State and al-Nusra. Are there grounds for such a bold statement?
Well, it's certain that they don't want al-Nusra to lose, because their agenda is to maintain a level of instability in the region which will allow them to project their own power, as they've done last night. So we've seen many other countries, in many other instances, that these false flag operations, these claims by, these strident claims by US officials of knowing exactly what the facts are, even though they don't know what the facts are. In some cases, they've jigged the facts to suit themselves. So these are simply excuses for action, and that's again the case that we've seen just now.
Yeah, just bringing in wider reaction here. In the past, indeed, French far-right presidential candidate Marine Le Pen warned that interventions in Iraq and Libya boost Islamic terrorism. Can that statement, can it be applied to the current situation, or is there too much of a divergence, too much difference on the ground there?
Well, I think terrorism is its own excuse. It acts on its own behalf, and I don't think we can blame everything that's done everywhere for the mentality of the terrorists. So, as I say, I think that what this is really is an example of fake news based on conclusions that were prepared in advance by the US neocons, the policy establishment that is deciding things in the US at the moment. So this is simply their agenda working itself out, and it will make peace harder to achieve in the region because, of course, those who might otherwise have wanted to surrender or to negotiate a surrender will now feel that the US effectively has become once again their air force, as it's been the air force for so many terrorists and so many rebels and so many other factions in other countries. So there will be less motivation for the opposition to Assad to recognize that essentially he won't lose and they can't win. They will now feel they can't lose themselves and they will carry on. And also this kind of action by the US will make terrorist incidents and indeed false flag operations whereby children are killed and murdered to create pictures for false attribution to various governments. This will make these kind of incidents more likely, not less likely, because they keep happening. They happened in Bosnia in the 1990s. They happened in Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. There's a whole history of serial episodes of this kind falsely blamed on the people who are targeted by the US policy establishment. And the success of this particular operation will only make more false atrocity stories more likely.
It's a horrifying thought, isn't it? But we can only assume that that is what is happening. Yeah, the head of the EU, Mark, and I'll just reiterate here that Donald Trump did not go to the United Nations Security Council before approving the strikes on the Syrian army. The EU Council chief Donald Tusk has called the attack a necessary step against brutality in Syria. Do you think we're going to see joint EU-US action in Syria going forward, despite the EU basically being thrown out of the loop in this case?
In essence, the UN, the United Nations, is for the US policymakers an inconvenience, and it's been an inconvenience ever since the end of the Cold War, because they want the right to unilaterally act whenever they feel it's appropriate or whenever it serves their interest. So this is in another example of them legitimizing before their own public, the Western public, which really swallows too much, too often. This is another example where they use children, the deaths of children, to promote their own anti-United Nations agenda and to stop the United Nations Security Council performing its function, the function for which it was formed after the Second World War, to maintain peace and security and to decide in what circumstances action of a different kind can be taken. The US wants to decide for itself, by itself, against anyone it pleases.
So much food for thought there. From London, Marco Gasic, International Affairs commentator. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if you're just joining us, welcome to RT International. Our only story this hour, breaking news from Syria. These are latest pictures from the Shariat military airfield that came under a large-scale cruise missile attack from US warships on Thursday night. It's the first direct US military action against President Assad's government and is supposedly in retaliation for an alleged chemical assault earlier this week on Tuesday. You can see there that some property has been destroyed. Russia's defense ministry says that it includes a material storage depot, a training facility, a canteen, 6 aircraft and a radar station. That's what's believed to be the extent of the damage, as well, of course, as 7 people, including 2 civilians, losing their lives. The runway has remained essentially undamaged. Now, another aspect that the Defence Ministry spoke about, out of the 59 missiles launched, only 23 are said to have reached the air base. It was called ineffective. Donald Trump, the US President, earlier gave this statement hours ago now from Florida. Let's take a listen.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council.
Here's Donald Trump shortly before he ordered the attack.
I think what happened in Syria is one of the truly egregious crimes, and it shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen. I think what happened in Syria is a disgrace to humanity, and he's there, and I guess he's running things, so something should happen.
Some 15 50 Tomahawk missiles were launched from U.S. Navy warships in the Mediterranean Sea. The Pentagon says that it notified Russia prior to the strikes and that it did not target sections of the base where Russian forces were believed to be present. This attack comes as the Trump administration claims it has no doubt that Bashar Assad's forces are responsible for the chemical attack near Idlib in Syria.
There is no doubt in our minds, and the information we have supports, that Syria, the Syrian regime under the leadership of President Bashar al-Assad are responsible for this attack.
It is important to note, U.S. officials expressed certainty that Bashar Assad launched the chemical attack near Idlib and now acted in response to it before anyone was able to investigate what exactly happened. The Russian Defense Ministry earlier said that they believe the Syrian Air Force had hit terrorists' chemical arsenal near Idlib. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has only begun its investigation into the incident. Apparently, the Trump administration decided not to wait for the results of the investigation. In their view, Assad did it, and the U.S. acted as judge, jury, and executioner in this case. On Russia, Rex Tillerson said this: either Russia's been complicit or Russia's been incompetent in its ability to deliver on the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. The U.S. Secretary of State also says Washington will be seeking Assad's removal from power through the Geneva process of negotiations.
Will you and President Trump organize an international coalition to remove Assad?
Those steps are underway.
The strikes that President Trump ordered against Syria do in some way resemble George W. Bush's decision to attack Iraq in 2003, because he did it without waiting for results of an investigation into Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Donald Trump notably blasted George W. Bush's decision. After all, it was the Iraq War that led to the creation of ISIS. Those who have long called for regime change in Syria, such as Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, now salute the strikes. However, lawmakers do seem divided on the president's order. Senator Rand Paul, for instance, wrote that the president needed congressional authorization for the military action, as the United States was not attacked. Senator Tim Kaine, who was Hillary Clinton's running mate, wrote the president's failure to seek congressional approval is unlawful. Other lawmakers pointed to Trump's own statement in August of 2013, including his tweet saying President Obama must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not. The White House now says President Trump did not need a congressional authorization for the strikes in Syria. The question, though, that few seem to be asking here in Washington, and probably no one at the White House, is why would Assad, regardless of what one thinks about him, launch a chemical attack and risk U.S. intervention at a time when he seems to be gaining the upper hand in the fight against the rebels and terrorists?
Well, we've been collecting a lot of reaction to what occurred a number of hours now. The governor of Homs province spoke to us, saying that Islamic State has launched an offensive in the area. Now, following the US strikes, the Syrian official added that the terrorists have specifically targeted oil-rich areas near Palmyra, which is around 2.5-hour drive from his region of Homs. So far, those terrorists have been held back. That was some hours ago. We're hoping that that is a similar situation. He also added that the US missile strikes will strengthen the militants' position in the region.
The Sherat airfield supports airstrikes against Islamic State. With its help, the Syrian army managed to liberate numerous areas near the city of Palmyra. The U.S. missile strike is an act of aggression against the Syrian Arab Republic, with the aim to weaken its ability to fight ISIL. This is direct support for terrorists in this region. According to all international regulations, this aggression should be condemned. At this time, the Syrian army is fighting against the terrorists, following them to the east of Palmyra.
Let's go live now to Syria, and our correspondent Lizzie Phelan, who's in the north of the country. Lizzie, just hearing there, a big fear for authorities in Syria is the terrorists trying to really use that power vacuum and take advantage of it. What else are we hearing where you are? You're in the country.
Right, well, as we've heard there from the governor of Homs, the Syrian government and army are saying that this American attack has unwittingly helped ISIS militants who only very recently were pushed out of the ancient city of Palmyra and the surrounding mountains and gas fields. Of course, it's not the first time that the Americans have been accused that their strikes on Syrian army positions have assisted ISIS forces. Just last year, there was a massive American attack that killed scores of Syrian army soldiers that were already besieged by ISIS forces in the eastern province of Deir ez-Zor. Now, back then, the Americans, of course, said that that attack was a mistake. Nevertheless, it did enable ISIS to make huge gains and capture a strategic mountain in Deir ez-Zor where the Syrian army was attacked there by ISIS. And, of course, the Americans do have a steady track record during the course of the Syrian conflict of their involvement in Syria, assisting extremist groups. Right from the beginning of the conflict, their support for various factions that the Americans were claiming were moderate groups, we then went on to join extremist Al-Qaeda affiliated groups and ISIS. And of course, the Pentagon itself a couple of years ago admitted that its flagship $500 million train and equip program resulted in the recruits to that program handing over American-supplied weapons to Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, then named Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, this latest attack is coming at a time when the Syrian army is facing threats from extremist groups on multiple fronts. Just in the last couple of days, Al-Qaeda's latest incarnation in Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, announced that it's launching a new offensive against the Syrian army in the Latakia province. So there are serious concerns that any further American action will only assist extremist groups in Syria, including those that the US itself labels as terrorist organizations, as we've seen just yesterday with ISIS reportedly taking advantage of this American attacks to try and advance on Syrian army positions.
Lizzie Phelan reporting from Syria on what we know there and how the Syrian military has been reacting to the attacks, really, from both sides, from terrorists and from Washington last night. Thank you, Lizzie. Well, America's military action has been met with some strong words from Moscow. Russia's top diplomats called it a violation of international law. This is what Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had to say.
Of course, it's an act of aggression under a completely invented pretext. It resembles a situation in 2003, when the US, the UK, and some of their allies invaded Iraq without the UN Security Council's approval, which was a severe violation of international law.
RT's Nikki Oren was listening to that speech by Sergei Lavrov, and indeed more reaction throughout the day. What comments else did we hear from Sergei Lavrov, Nikki, and indeed from those other Russian officials?
Well, Sergei Lavrov was speaking about an hour and a half ago now, and it was a very brief yet concise statement, and he touched upon how disappointed he was at how US-Russia relations will now take a turn for the worse, especially when there was so much hope that things would get better between the two countries and their relations. He also said that the US had acted rashly without waiting for the results of that crucial UN investigation into that chemical weapons attack in Idlib province, and Russia will be demanding full disclosure of what led the US to make that decision to launch the strike last night in Homs. He added that the US strike may possibly be an attempt to distract attention from the actions of the group Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Let's take a listen to what he said.
It looks like they wanted to distract attention from Jabhat al-Nusra, which is seemingly still considered by some a reserve squadron to switch from peace talks to regime change. It's also frustrating that it harms already soured relations between Russia and the US. But I hope those provocations won't lead to any irreversible consequences.
irreversible consequences there, Mr. Lavrov said. Also interesting that he also touched upon the US strike and how he thought it resembled the military intervention in Iraq in 2003, which ultimately, arguably, led to the creation of Islamic State in the first place. The latest development on the reaction from Russia has been from the Ministry of Defense, which said that Russia is awaiting an explanation from the US on what Washington has called its indisputable proof that the Syrian army was responsible for that chemical weapons attack in Idlib province earlier this week. And in the meantime, a system of measures to bolster and increase the effectiveness of Syria's air defense system will be implemented. He also confirmed that the airstrike was followed by a large-scale offensive against Syrian army forces by Jabhat al-Nusra and Islamic State. This was allegations early this morning, and the Ministry of Defense said did occur. He said that he hopes that this was not in any way coordinated with the US. He also suggested that the airstrike in Homs may have been planned prior to that chemical weapons attack in Idlib province, if confirmed, would completely blow out of the water the comments made by the US president that this airstrike in Homs was in retaliation for the chemical weapons attack earlier this week. We've also heard from the Foreign Ministry, and the Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova had this to say. Take a listen.
It's not the first time that the U.S. has shown such an unreflecting approach, which is just worsening existing world problems and creating a threat to the international security.
The Foreign Ministry there also calling the US actions illegal, and as a result Russia will now be halting that deal it has with the US military, which was put in place to prevent incidents such as friendly fire incidents and ensure flight security in Syria. That was a memorandum of understanding signed between the two countries back in 2015. Finally, more condemnation from the Kremlin. The Russian president's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has called the strike an act of aggression against a sovereign nation and conducted under a made-up pretext. As we know, the Syrian army was confirmed by the UN chemical weapons watchdog not to have any chemical weapons in the country. The Kremlin spokesperson also said that the motive of the attack could be to distract attention away from the scores of civilians being killed in Iraq as a result of the US-led intervention there.